April 25, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. Somewhere in the chaos of a European theater collapsing faster than anyone had planned for. A memo went out that day to camera units of the United States Army Signal Corps, an order that read on its surface like a routine administrative directive. Every liberated concentration camp was to be documented completely, still photographs and motion picture footage both, covering everything from the barracks and the bodies to the crematoria and the survivors, gathered not as a courtesy record, but as evidence. The memo specifically flagged the material's potential use before the Judge Advocate General's War Crimes Commission, a legal body most soldiers on the ground had never heard of and had no reason to think about while they were still fighting a war that hadn't technically ended yet, still weeks away from the final German surrender. The order didn't come from nowhere. 2 weeks earlier, on April 12th, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had personally walked through the camp at Ohrdruf alongside Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, the three of them absorbing, in near total silence, the sight of prisoners who had been tortured and executed just before the fleeing SS abandoned the site. Eisenhower would later write that he had never felt fully able to describe his own emotional reaction in the moment he came face to face with proof of exactly what the Nazi system had actually been doing. Indisputable evidence. He called it a brutality and a ruthless disregard for every basic standard of human decency. Whatever words failed him personally, he had no trouble at all translating that reaction into policy. Within days of the Ohrdruf visit, he had ordered that every unit within reach walk through the camp themselves, and that German civilians from the surrounding area be marched through it too, so they could no longer plausibly claim ignorance of what had happened a few miles from their own homes. In Weimar, near the main Buchenwald camp, he went further still, ordering roughly 1,000 local civilians to tour the grounds under armed escort, an order that would be echoed at camp after camp across the American and British occupation zones over the following weeks. By late April, that instinct forced people to see it directly, with their own eyes, so no future denial could ever fully take hold, had expanded into something far larger than individual camp visits, growing from a single general's personal reaction into a coordinated, multi-front Allied policy applied across every occupation zone simultaneously. The Signal Corps documentation ordered on April 25th wasn't just about preserving evidence for a future trial, though that purpose mattered enormously to men who understood. Even in the war's final chaotic weeks, that physical evidence would eventually fade and memories would eventually be challenged or denied. It was about creating material that could be shown deliberately and repeatedly to exactly the people the Allied command believed most needed to see it: German soldiers, German prisoners of war, and German civilians who had spent 12 years insisting, in one form or another, that they had no real understanding of what their own government was doing behind camp walls a few miles from their own homes and workplaces. The scale of the effort matched the scale of what needed documenting. Camera crews weren't sent to a handful of representative sites and asked to generalize from what they found there. They were dispatched to every camp Allied forces liberated across the entire Western Front, tasked with capturing not a summary but a comprehensive visual record. Understanding that the sheer breadth of locations documented would itself become part of the argument against any future claim that what happened represented isolated excess rather than systematic policy. If you want to hear the stories that show you exactly what it took to force an entire nation to confront what had been done in its name, subscribe. We find these accounts, we verify them, and we tell them exactly as they happened. The raw footage itself came from dozens of cameramen fanning out across every camp Allied forces liberated that spring: Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Nordhausen, and others, each crew capturing largely the same unbearable inventory of evidence. Piles of unburied bodies. Survivors too weak to stand unassisted. Crematoria still holding partial remains. Interviews with prisoners describing, in their own words and their own languages, exactly what they had endured over months and years of captivity. Many of these cameramen had spent the previous months documenting ordinary combat operations, artillery positions, and troop movements, work that had prepared them technically for the assignment, but nothing had prepared them emotionally for what they were now being asked to point their cameras at, day after day, camp after camp. A specialized team of 45 men, informally nicknamed the Stevens Irregulars after the Hollywood director George Stevens, who helped oversee the project, worked to assemble the raw material into something coherent, a 59-minute film that would eventually be released under the title Nazi Concentration Camps, produced under Stevens' supervision with backing from fellow director John Ford, built entirely from footage shot by military photographers who had, in most cases, never handled a camera under circumstances anything like this before. Stevens himself had built his pre-war reputation directing comedies and light dramas in Hollywood. The work he oversaw in 1945 stood about as far from that career as any assignment could have taken him, and colleagues who knew him both before and after the war would later describe a man who never fully returned to the lighter sensibility that had defined his earlier films. What made the resulting film different from ordinary newsreel coverage of the war wasn't just its subject matter. It was the deliberate, unflinching choice to include material most wartime censors would have cut from anything intended for general audiences, bodies and states most viewers had never been asked to look at directly, survivors whose physical condition made clear exactly how close they had come to becoming part of the same piles of the dead surrounding them. Footage held on screen for long, unbroken stretches rather than cut away from quickly the way conventional newsreel editing might have softened it. The footage wasn't softened for public consumption. It was assembled specifically to be undeniable, built by editors who understood that brevity or restraint would only give future skeptics room to argue the material had been selectively framed. Once the film existed, Allied command moved quickly to put it in front of exactly the audience's Eisenhower's original instinct after Ohrdruf had already identified. Compulsory screenings began within days of the camp's liberation and continued as deliberate, sustained policy rather than a single symbolic gesture, running for months across multiple occupation zones and multiple audience categories simultaneously. German prisoners of war held in Allied custody, some still in Europe, others transported as far as camps inside the United States itself. Thousands of miles from the actual sites the footage depicted, were marched into makeshift theaters and required to watch. Photographs taken during these screenings, now held in the archive of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, capture rows of German POWs seated in the dark, faces lit only by the projector's glow, expressions ranging from stunned disbelief to something closer to open grief. Men who had spent years fighting for the same government the footage now indicted in the plainest possible terms. Many of them ordinary soldiers who had never personally witnessed a camp and had genuinely believed, or told themselves they believed, that the worst rumors circulating about the regime they served had been exaggerated. The policy extended well beyond soldiers already in custody. In towns across occupied Germany, local mayors were instructed to ensure their residents attended screenings. Tickets distributed not as an invitation, but as an obligation stamped with the full authority of the occupying military government. In some towns, American and British soldiers reportedly rounded civilians up directly off the street when voluntary compliance ran short, treating attendance less as a request than as an extension of the same denazification apparatus already dismantling Nazi party infrastructure across the occupied zones. In the town of Hildesheim, British authorities specifically targeted local Nazi party members for a mandatory screening. Individuals whose prior political affiliation made their claimed ignorance of the regime's crimes especially difficult to credit, and when several of them attempted to leave partway through, soldiers physically returned them to their seats rather than allow them to walk out before the film had finished, making clear that partial attendance wasn't going to satisfy the requirement. Reactions to the screenings, documented in psychological reports compiled by American observers at the time, were far from uniform, and the range of responses itself became a subject of ongoing military and political interest as occupation authorities tried to gauge how effectively the policy was actually working. Many viewers responded with what investigators recorded simply as shock and dismay, the same reaction American soldiers themselves had experienced walking through the camps in person weeks earlier, sitting in stunned silence through footage that offered no room for the kind of distance a second-hand account might have allowed. But the same reports noted a competing response running alongside the shock, open resentment among some viewers of being forced to watch it all. Regardless of what the footage actually showed, a reaction occupation psychologist interpreted less as denial of the content itself and more as resistance to the coercive method of the confrontation. In parts of the British occupation zone, observers documented Germans in the audience shouting that the footage had to be faked, or countering the images on screen with references to Allied bombing campaigns against cities like Hamburg and Dresden, an attempt to relativize what they were being shown rather than absorb it directly, deflecting toward Allied conduct as a way of avoiding the specific accusation the footage was making about their own government's actions. Some viewers responded with what soldiers supervising the screenings interpreted as nervous, uncomfortable laughter, a reaction later observers would debate at length, uncertain whether it represented genuine denial, simple psychological overload, or something closer to shame too large to process in any other visible form, a coping response rather than genuine indifference. Eisenhower's reasoning behind the broader policy went beyond simple punishment or public shaming. He had ordered American soldiers to walk through the camps themselves for a related but distinct reason, so that the men fighting this war understood plainly, in terms no abstract justification could replace, exactly what kind of enemy they had actually been fighting for the past several years. The same logic applied, in his view, to German soldiers and civilians on the other side of that same divide. If the war's purpose had ever been in danger of feeling abstract or distant to anyone standing on either side of the front line, the footage removed that distance completely. There was no version of neutrality left available to anyone who had actually watched it. The footage's significance didn't end with these forced screenings. On November 29, 1945, portions of Nazi concentration camps were formally presented as evidence before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, entered into the official trial record against the surviving senior leadership of the Nazi regime, projected in a courtroom built specifically to hold the men most responsible for the system the footage documented. Defendants who had spent months constructing legal arguments about orders, hierarchies, and diminished personal responsibility sat in the same courtroom forced to watch the same unedited footage that German POWs and civilians had already been made to sit through in theaters across occupied Germany months earlier. Observers present in the courtroom that day described a distinct, uncomfortable silence settling over the proceedings as the lights dimmed and the footage began to roll. Several defendants reportedly unable to maintain eye contact with the screen for the full runtime, a few looking away entirely during the most difficult stretches even as prosecutors and judges continued watching without interruption. The film that had begun as a policy of forced civilian confrontation became, by the war crimes trial's own late 1945 proceedings, direct legal evidence, footage originally intended to make ordinary Germans confront what their government had done, now doing exactly the same work in a courtroom, against the men who had actually run the system the footage documented. Prosecutors specifically chose to screen it early in their presentation of evidence, understanding that whatever legal arguments followed over the coming months would need to be measured against images the tribunal, the press, and the watching public had already absorbed directly rather than through secondhand summary. The broader documentation campaign Eisenhower set in motion after Ohrdruf, the camp tours, the forced civilian confrontations, the film screenings, and finally the courtroom evidence at Nuremberg, represented a coordinated, deliberate strategy built around a single conviction, that the only reliable defense against future denial was direct, undeniable, repeatedly witnessed evidence, presented to as many different audiences through as many different channels as the Allied command could possibly manage in the war's final chaotic months. Soldiers saw it in person. Townspeople were marched past it. Prisoners of war were seated in front of it on a screen. Judges and defendants alike watched it projected in a courtroom. By the time the last screening had concluded and the last trial verdict had been read, the record Eisenhower had insisted on building since the moment he first walked into Ohrdruf existed in more forms, reaching more people than any single camp visit or single trial could ever have accomplished alone. Nazi concentration camps went on to become one of the most consequential pieces of documentary evidence produced anywhere in the 20th century, studied by historians, screened in classrooms, and referenced in nearly every subsequent legal and educational effort to document the Holocaust in the decades that followed. The forced screenings that first put the film in front of German POWs and civilians in the spring and summer of 1945 have themselves become a subject of historical study, examined by researchers interested in exactly the questions the original occupation psychologists were already asking at the time: what forced confrontation with undeniable evidence actually accomplishes, what it doesn't, and how differently individual human beings respond when presented with proof of atrocity they cannot claim any longer not to have seen with their own eyes. The photographs of those German POWs sitting in the dark, faces lit by the projector, remain among the most striking visual documents of the war's immediate aftermath. Not a battlefield, not a courtroom, but a movie theater, doing work no other institution in the immediate post-war chaos was quite positioned to do in exactly the same way. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that show what it actually took to make sure the truth reached everyone who needed to see it, subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep finding these accounts, verifying them, and telling them exactly as they happened.